The radar operator aboard the escort carrier USS Street Low couldn't believe what he was seeing. At 6:45 a.m. on the 25th of October 1944, his screen showed what appeared to be an entire fleet emerging from the darkness off Samar Island. But that was impossible. American intelligence had assured them that the Japanese center force, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, had retreated after being hammered in the Sibuyan Sea the previous day. Yet here they were. The distinctive radar signatures of battleships, massive, unmistakable, and heading directly toward Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3. Within minutes, lookouts confirmed the nightmare. On the horizon, emerging from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters, came the largest collection of Japanese naval power assembled in months. 4 battleships led the formation, their pagoda-style superstructures unmistakable even at 20 miles distance. Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, received the first visual. Report at 6:47 a.m. His reaction, recorded in the ship's log, consisted of a single expletive, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Sprague commanded 6 escort carriers, small, slow vessels designed to provide air support for ground operations, not fight surface battles. These baby flat-tops could barely make 18 knots with a favourable wind. Their thin hulls, constructed to merchant ship standards rather than warship specifications, could be penetrated by armour-piercing shells like paper. His escort force consisted of 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. 7 ships mounting 5-inch guns against a fleet that included the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, carrying 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 26 miles. Each of Yamato's main battery shells weighed more than an American destroyer's anchor. The disparity wasn't merely numerical, it was categorical. This wasn't David versus Goliath. This was David versus Goliath's entire extended family, all armed with machine guns, while David had a slingshot. By every principle of naval warfare developed over centuries, Taffy 3 was already dead. The only question was how quickly the execution would occur. Admiral Kurita's center force represented Japan's last gamble in the Philippines campaign. The plan, designated Shogo or Victory Operation, called for 3 separate Japanese fleets to converge on Leyte Gulf, where American amphibious forces were landing troops to retake the Philippines. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force would serve as bait, luring Admiral William Bull Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. With Halsey gone, Kurita would blast through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. The plan had worked perfectly, too perfectly. Halsey had taken the bait, racing north with every battleship, carrier and cruiser under his command to destroy Ozawa's decoy carriers. The southern approach to Leyte Gulf was blocked by Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battleship squadron, which had just annihilated the southern Japanese force in history's last battleship versus battleship action at Surigao Strait. But the San Bernardino Strait lay open. Halsey, assuming Kurita had retreated after taking heavy air attacks the previous day, had left the central approach unguarded. No battleships, no cruisers, no heavy ships of any kind protected the carriers and transports. Only Taffy 3 stood between Kurita's battleships and the destruction of the entire American amphibious operation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kurita's force was formidable beyond measure. The super-battleship Yamato displaced 72,000 tons heavier than any 2 American battleships combined. Her sister ship Nagato had survived since the Battle Tsushima era. The battleships Kongo and Haruna, though older, still mounted 14-inch guns that could obliterate any ship in Taffy 3 with a single salvo. 6 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, Tone, Haguro, and Chokai, added 8-inch guns to the overwhelming firepower. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the force. Combined, these ships carried more than 130 major caliber guns, ranging from 5-inch to 18.1-inch. Taffy 3's entire escort force mounted exactly 16 operational 5-inch guns across 7 ships, and those guns had a maximum range of 18,000 yards, less than half the range of Japanese battleship main batteries. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, received the sighting report in his cramped sea cabin. A Cherokee from Oklahoma, Evans had told his crew upon taking command, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one had left. Now, as he rushed to the bridge, those words would be tested beyond anything he had imagined. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the finest destroyer designs of the war. She displaced 2,700 tons, mounted 5 5-inch guns in single turrets, and carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. She could make 38 knots in calm seas, but speed wouldn't save her today. The Japanese battleships could hit her long before she got within torpedo range, and their armor was too thick for her guns to penetrate at any range. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, executive officer of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, watched the Japanese fleet through binoculars with a sense of professional detachment, giving way to dread. The Roberts was even smaller than the destroyers, only 1,700 tons, with 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. Her crew called her the destroyer escort that thought she was a destroyer. But thinking didn't change physics. She was a lightweight boxer being thrown into the ring with heavyweight champions. The escort carriers began launching aircraft immediately, but they carried primarily bombs and rockets for ground support missions, not armor-piercing ordnance for attacking battleships. Worse, many planes were already airborne on patrol missions and would need time to rearm and refuel before attacking. Time measured in minutes that Taffy 3 didn't have. Admiral Sprague faced the most agonizing decision in naval warfare: sacrifice his escorts to save the carriers, or flee, and hope speed and luck would suffice. The mathematics were brutal. If the battleships closed to gun range with the carriers, they would destroy them in minutes. The only way to buy time was to send the escorts to attack, knowing they would almost certainly be destroyed. At 6:50 a.m. Just 3 minutes after the first sighting, Sprague gave the order that would define the battle: small boys attack. In naval terminology, small boys meant destroyers and destroyer escorts. The order was simple, direct, and amounted to a death sentence. Commander Evans didn't wait for the order. At 6:50 a.m., even as Sprague's command was being transmitted, Johnston was already accelerating to flank speed, black smoke pouring from her stacks as her boilers were pushed to maximum pressure. Evans ordered his ship to turn directly toward the Japanese fleet alone, unsupported, charging 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. His crew, most barely old enough to vote, moved to their stations with practiced efficiency. In the forward fire control tower, Lieutenant Edward DeGardi began calculating firing solutions for targets still 15 miles away. In the engine room, men worked in 120-degree heat to coax every possible knot from the straining turbines. The torpedo tubes swung out, ready to launch their deadly fish when, if they got close enough, the Japanese opened fire at 6:58 a.m. The heavy cruiser Kumano fired the first salvo at extreme range, more as a ranging shot than with any expectation of hitting. Massive columns of water erupted 200 yards short of the fleeing carriers, each splash towering over 100 feet into the air. The shells, weighing 300 pounds each, created shockwaves that could rupture a ship's hull even with a near miss. Johnston raced through the shell splashes, zigzagging at 30 knots, closing the range to the Japanese fleet, while the carriers fled in the opposite direction. It was tactically insane, one destroyer charging a fleet, but it embodied everything the US Navy meant by the word fighting spirit. At 7:10 a.m., at a range of 18,000 yards, maximum effective range for her 5-inch guns, Johnston opened fire. Her forward guns barked in rapid succession, sending 54-pound shells arcing toward the heavy cruiser Kumano. The shells couldn't penetrate the cruiser's armor, but they could damage her superstructure, kill exposed crew, and most importantly, distract her. Commander Thomas Hathaway, captain of the destroyer Heermann, watched Johnston's lone charge with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Evans is either the bravest man I've ever seen," he said to his executive officer, "or the craziest. Probably both." Then he ordered his own ship to follow Johnston into the maelstrom. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, commanding the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, received Sprague's small boys' attack order with grim determination. His ship was the smallest and most lightly armed in the escort force. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected," he told his crew over the 1MC intercom. "We will do what damage we can." Then he swung Roberts toward the enemy and rang up flank speed. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts followed. USS Hoel under Commander Leon Kintberger, USS Dennis under Lieutenant Commander Samuel Hansen, USS John C. Butler under Lieutenant Commander John Pace, and USS Raymond under Commander Arnold Rosa. 7 small ships, their combined displacement less than a single Japanese battleship, turned toward an enemy fleet that could destroy them all without sustaining meaningful damage. What happened next would become legend. The small boys of Taffy 3 didn't just attack, they charged with such ferocity and tactical brilliance that they convinced Admiral Kurita he was facing a major American fleet rather than a handful of escorts. The Battle off Samar was about to demonstrate that courage, when combined with desperation and tactical skill, could achieve what seemed mathematically impossible. The Japanese battleship Yamato fired her first salvo at 7:01 a.m., targeting the carrier White Plains. 9 18.1-inch shells, each weighing more than a small car, arced through the sky. They missed, but the splashes they created were visible from 20 miles away, geysers of water that rose over 300 feet, taller than the carrier's flight decks. Each near miss created a hammer blow of pressure that threatened to buckle hulls and rupture seams. Commander Evans, watching those massive shells land, knew he had perhaps 10 minutes before Johnston was in range for effective torpedo attack, and less than 5 minutes before the Japanese battleships would turn their attention from the carriers to the impudent destroyer racing toward them. His navigator, Lieutenant Jack Stewart, was calculating the optimal approach angle when the first Japanese salvo targeted Johnston specifically. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo straddled the destroyer, one short, one long, one barely missing the stern. The concussion from the near misses knocked men off their feet and shattered light bulbs throughout the ship. "All ahead, flank," Evans ordered calmly, though his knuckles were white on the bridge railing. "Come left to course 270. Stand by torpedoes." The battle off Samar had entered its second phase. The lone charge was becoming a coordinated attack. 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts were accelerating to attack speed, their crews knowing they were almost certainly dead men, but determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Behind them, 6 escort carriers fled south, their crews watching in awe and horror as their thin-skinned escorts charged the most powerful battleships afloat. In 15 minutes, Johnston would launch her torpedoes at point-blank range into the Japanese fleet. In 30 minutes, the entire character of the battle would shift. In 2 hours, the seas off Samar would hold wreckage and heroes in equal measure. But in this moment, at 7:10 a.m., on the 25th of October 1944, 7 small ships were doing something that defied every principle of naval warfare. They were attacking when they should have been fleeing, fighting when they should have been dying. Admiral Kurita, from his bridge aboard Yamato, watched the American destroyers charging his fleet with growing confusion. No destroyer captain in his right mind would attack battleships head-on unless he was supported by a larger force. Where were the American battleships? Where were Halsey's carriers? This had to be a trap, a delaying action while the real American fleet maneuvered into position. This miscalculation, born from the sheer audacity of the American attack, would save Taffy 3. But that salvation would be purchased with blood and steel, paid for by men who charged into gunfire because there was no other choice, who fought battleships with destroyer guns because courage demanded nothing less. The Sacrifice Squadron was attacking. History was about to witness something unprecedented. The moment when the smallest ships in the US Navy taught the world that size matters less than heart, and that sometimes, against all odds and logic, the destroyers with 5-inch guns charge anyway. At 7:15 a.m. Commander Ernest Evans' voice came over USS Johnston's intercom system with eerie calm. Stand by for torpedo launch. All guns. Commence rapid fire on targets of opportunity. What followed would be described by survivors as either the bravest or most suicidal 15 minutes in naval history, quite possibly both. Johnston had closed to 10,000 yards of the Japanese fleet, well within the range where battleship shells could find her with devastating accuracy. Evans had brought his ship through a forest of shell splashes, any one of which could have ended her voyage instantly. Now, racing at 35 knots through smoke and spray, she was finally in position to strike back. The heavy cruiser Kumano loomed in Lieutenant Degardi's fire control site, her pagoda superstructure making her instantly identifiable. At 9,000 yards, she was an impossible target to miss. Solution locked, Degardi reported. Ready to fire. Fire all torpedoes, Evans ordered. 10 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes leaped from their tubes, each carrying a 600-pound Torpex warhead capable of breaking a cruiser's back. They hit the water with distinctive splashes and began their run toward the Japanese formation at 45 knots. The spread was textbook perfect. If Kumano turned toward the torpedoes, she'd hit the inner spread. If she turned away, the outer fish would get her. The torpedoes had barely entered the water when Johnston heeled hard to port, reversing course at maximum speed. Evans had no intention of watching his weapons hit home at this range. Staying in place meant certain death. Japanese gunners had been tracking Johnston throughout her run, and now every ship in the formation that could bear seemed to fire at once. The sea around Johnston erupted. A 14-inch shell from Congo struck her port side at the waterline, punching completely through the hull and exiting the starboard side without exploding a dud that nonetheless left 2 gaping holes and flooded the after engine room. A 6-inch shell from a cruiser exploded against the bridge, killing 3 men and severely wounding Commander Evans, who refused morphine so he could maintain command. More shells rained down. A near miss to starboard lifted the destroyer completely out of the water, her keel visible for a moment before she crashed back down. The impact knocked out her gyro compass and fire control radar. Another hit destroyed the aft 5-inch gun mount, killing its entire crew. A third shell penetrated the forward engine room, killing everyone inside and reducing Johnston's speed to 17 knots. Yet, even as she took these mortal wounds, Johnston's torpedoes were running true. At 7:24 a.m., 3 explosions rippled along Kumano's port side. The heavy cruiser staggered as if punched by a giant fist. Her bow, shattered by multiple torpedo hits, began to separate from the hull. She slewed out of formation, down by the head, leaking oil and trailing steam. Kumano would survive, but she was done fighting. One destroyer had just knocked one of Japan's most powerful cruisers out of the battle. The trade a crippled destroyer for a disabled cruiser seemed poor on paper, but it had bought precious minutes for the escort carriers and thrown the Japanese formation into confusion. Commander Evans, blood streaming from wounds to his face and neck, surveyed the damage to his ship. "We still have 3 working guns and we can still steam," he announced. "We're still in this fight." 3 miles to the north, USS Hoel under Commander Leon Kintberger was making her own desperate run. Unlike Johnston's surprise attack, Hoel faced concentrated fire from the moment she began her approach. Battleship Congo and her escorts seemed determined to make an example of this impudent destroyer. Hoel twisted and turned like a boxer dodging punches, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. At 7:27 a.m., a 16-inch shell from Congo struck her amidships, penetrating the engine room and erupting out her port side. The explosion killed 30 men instantly and reduced her speed to 27 knots. Commander Kintberger, thrown against the bridge bulkhead by the impact, pulled himself up and shouted, "Maintain course, we're going in." Hoel had one advantage. She carried more torpedoes than Johnston 15 fish in 3 quintuple mounts. If she could get close enough to launch, she could devastate the Japanese formation. The question was whether she'd survive long enough to get there. Another shell hit, this one destroying the forward fire room and further reducing speed to 17 knots. Hoel was now barely faster than the battleships she was attacking. But Kintberger preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Pressed on. At 8,000 yards point-blank range for battleship guns, he ordered the torpedo launch. 15 torpedoes entered the water, their wakes spreading in a fan toward the Japanese battleships. Kongo turned hard to port to avoid them, throwing off her gun solutions. Haruna maneuvered in the opposite direction, opening a gap in the formation. The torpedoes all missed, but they had achieved something almost valuable. They had scattered the Japanese formation, forcing the battleships to maneuver individually rather than maintaining concentrated fire. Hoel didn't survive to see the result. As she reversed course, battleship Haruna found her range. 3 14-inch shells hit within 5 seconds. One struck the bridge, killing most of the officers, including the executive officer. Another penetrated the forward magazine, which miraculously didn't explode. The third demolished the after engine room. Dead in the water, listing 20 degrees to port, Hoel continued firing her remaining guns. Lieutenant James McWhorter, the senior surviving officer, had control of only the forward 5-inch mount, but he kept it firing at the battleship Haruna, even as shell after shell slammed into the dying destroyer. At 8:30 a.m., with water pouring through dozens of holes and fires burning out of control, McWhorter gave the order to abandon ship. Men jumped into the oil-covered water as Hoel rolled onto her port side, her ensign still flying from the mast. At 8:55 a.m., she disappeared beneath the waves, taking 253 men with her. USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that thought she was a destroyer, made the most improbable charge of all. At only 1,700 tons, she was less than half the size of the fleet destroyers and carried only 3 torpedo tubes and 2 5-inch guns. By any rational standard, she should have stayed back, using smoke to screen the carriers. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland had other ideas. "We're making a torpedo run," he announced. "We may not survive, but we're taking one of those bastards with us." Roberts accelerated to her maximum speed of 28 knots, slow by destroyer standards, but the fastest she could manage. Her approach took her directly across the bow of battleship Yamato, close enough that her crew could see Japanese sailors on the battleship's deck. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to hit such a small, close target, but her secondary armament could. 6-inch shells began landing around Roberts as she closed to 4,000 yards, the range where her 3 torpedoes might actually have a chance of hitting. "Fire torpedoes," Copeland ordered. 3 torpedoes entered the water and ran toward Yamato. Whether any hit remains disputed, Japanese records are unclear, and American observers saw at least one explosion against Yamato's hull, though it may have been a shell splash. What's certain is that Yamato turned hard to avoid the torpedo tracks, taking her out of the battle for crucial minutes. But Roberts paid dearly for her audacity. As she turned away from her torpedo run, the heavy cruiser Chikuma found her range. An 8-inch shell struck her port side, penetrating the engine room and killing everyone inside. The explosion blew a hole in the hull large enough to drive a truck through. Roberts slowed to 12 knots, then 8, then stopped entirely. Her remaining 5-inch gun, Gun 52, mounted aft, continued firing under local control. Gunner's mate 3rd class Paul Henry Carr, though wounded by shrapnel, manually loaded and fired the gun, even as blood loss weakened him. When the ammunition hoist jammed, Carr carried shells up from the magazine by hand. When his crew was killed by a direct hit, he loaded and fired alone. When a shell exploded prematurely in the gun barrel, the blast tore open Carr's chest and abdomen. He refused medical attention, holding his intestines in place with one hand while trying to load one more shell with the other. "We've got to get this gun back in action," he gasped to the damage control party that found him. He died moments later, still trying to load that final shell. He would be recommended for the Medal of Honor posthumously, one of many heroes aboard Roberts, by 9 a.m. Roberts was sinking. Copeland gave the order to abandon ship, and men began jumping into the sea as Japanese cruisers continued pumping shells into the already doomed vessel. She finally rolled over and sank at 9:10 a.m., her colours still flying. Of her crew of 224, only 89 survived. USS Heermann, under Commander Thomas Hathaway, executed perhaps the most tactically brilliant attack of the battle. Rather than making a straight torpedo run, Hathaway manoeuvred Heermann between the escort carriers and the Japanese battleships, deliberately drawing fire to protect the more valuable vessels. At 7:35 a.m., with Japanese shells landing all around, Hathaway ordered a turn directly toward battleship Haruna. The maneuver was insane, deliberately reducing the range to a ship that outgunned and outweighed Heermann by a factor of 20. But the tactic worked. Haruna's captain, assuming no destroyer captain would be foolish enough to attack at such close range without support, believed he was facing a cruiser or perhaps a light battleship emerging from smoke. He ordered Haruna to turn away, opening the distance. Heermann launched her torpedoes at 6,000 yards, close enough to ensure hits, far enough to escape before the battleship's secondary batteries could pulverize her. The torpedoes missed Haruna but forced the battleship Yamato to turn hard to port, taking the super-battleship out of action for nearly 10 minutes, while she maneuvered to avoid the spread. Throughout this maneuver, Heermann's 5.5-inch guns never stopped firing. Her crew achieved something remarkable. They hit the heavy cruiser Chikuma repeatedly, starting fires and damaging her superstructure. A destroyer was fighting a heavy cruiser to a standstill. Heermann didn't emerge unscathed. She took multiple hits from 8-inch and 6-inch shells. One shell penetrated her forward magazine, which failed to explode only because the crew had already moved most of the ammunition to safer locations. Another destroyed her after fire room, reducing her speed to 23 knots. A third jammed her rudder hard to port, forcing her to steam in circles until damage control teams could jury-rig repairs. Yet Heermann survived, the only destroyer in the Taffy 3 screen to do so, because Commander Hathaway fought her with a combination of aggression and tactical cunning that kept the Japanese off balance. He would attack, fall back into smoke, emerge from a different angle, launch torpedoes, retreat, and attack again. The Japanese never knew where he would appear next. The destroyer escorts USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond fought their own desperate actions. These small ships, designed to hunt submarines rather than fight surface battles, charged into combat against cruisers and battleships with a ferocity that stunned Japanese observers. Dennis, under Lieutenant Commander Samuel Hansen, made a torpedo run on the heavy cruiser Tone, scoring at least one hit that reduced the cruiser's speed. She then turned her guns on the light cruiser Yahagi, setting fires that would eventually force the Japanese ship to withdraw. John C. Butler and Raymond fought a tag-team battle against the heavy cruiser Haguro, dodging in and out of smoke while pumping 5-inch shells at the vastly more powerful opponent. They couldn't penetrate her armor, but they damaged her fire control systems and killed exposed crew, reducing her combat effectiveness. By 8:30 a.m., the torpedo phase of the battle was over. Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts were sinking or sunk, but they had achieved something extraordinary. They had thrown the Japanese formation into chaos, damaged or sunk multiple cruisers, and bought precious time for the escort carriers. More importantly, their sheer audacity had convinced Admiral Kurita that he faced a much larger force than actually existed. No destroyer squadron would attack 4 battleships unless supported by heavy ships. Where were the American battleships? Where were the carriers? The question gnawed at Kurita, making him cautious when boldness would have won the day. The sacrifice squadron had done its job. Now it remained to be seen whether that sacrifice would be enough to save Taffy 3. At 8:30 a.m., on the 25th of October, 1944, Admiral Clifton Sprague faced what appeared to be the final moments of his command. 3 of his 7 escorts were sinking or sunk. Japanese shells were landing among his escort carriers, scoring hits that should have sent the thin-skinned vessels to the bottom. The street, Lowe had taken damage to her flight deck. The Kalinin Bay had been hit repeatedly, her hull perforated by more than a dozen shells. The Fanshawe Bay, Sprague's flagship, had taken hits that killed 50 men and started fires that threatened her magazines. Yet somehow, impossibly, Taffy 3 was still afloat, still fighting, still fleeing south at 18 knots while the remnants of her escort screen fought a delaying action that defied every principle of naval warfare. What Sprague couldn't know, what no American on the scene could know, was that his seemingly doomed command was winning. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force from the bridge of the super-battleship Yamato, was reaching the breaking point. For 2.5 hours, his vastly superior fleet had been unable to bring the American carriers to bay. Destroyers that should have been obliterated in minutes had charged his battleships, launched torpedoes, and forced his formation to scatter. Escort carriers that should have been easy targets were dodging and weaving, using rain squalls and smoke with a tactical skill that suggested experienced commanders rather than the reservists he'd expected. And the aircraft, wave after wave of aircraft from the carriers, attacking with a desperation that bordered on kamikaze tactics. Planes were making dry runs, attacking without bombs to disrupt fire control and force his ships to maneuver. Pilots were dropping depth charges designed for submarines against armored cruisers. Some aircraft were making strafing runs with empty guns, the pilots hoping their approach would force Japanese ships to turn. The culmination came at 8:45 a.m., when Kurita's flagship Yamato found herself bracketed by what appeared to be a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Torpedoes in the water to starboard forced her to turn hard to port. As she turned, a flight of Avengers from the carrier Gambia Bay came in low from dead ahead, forcing her to turn back to starboard. While maneuvering, a destroyer, the crippled but still fighting USS Johnston, emerged from smoke at 7,000 yards and began hitting her superstructure with 5-inch shells. The shells couldn't penetrate Yamato's armor, but they killed exposed crew and damaged fire control equipment. More crucially, they demonstrated that even now, hours into the battle, American forces were still attacking. Where were these ships coming from? How many more were out there? Commander Evans, his face a mask of blood from wounds that would have put most men in shock, personally directed Johnston's fire. With only 3 working guns and a top speed of 17 knots, his ship was effectively doomed, but he was determined to take as many Japanese ships with him as possible. "Target that cruiser," he ordered, pointing at the heavy cruiser Tone. "Make every shot count." Johnston's surviving guns fired methodically, the crews working with the calm of men who had accepted their fate but refused to surrender to it. They hit Tone repeatedly, starting fires and forcing her to turn away to assess damage. At 9:20 a.m., Japanese cruisers finally cornered Johnston. With her speed reduced to 5 knots and most of her guns out of action, she had nowhere to run. Shell after shell slammed into her, each impact sending up geysers of steam and smoke. Her hull, already perforated by dozens of earlier hits, began to break apart under the hammering. Commander Evans, standing on what remained of the bridge, watched Japanese destroyers close to finish his ship. A sailor nearby reported that a Japanese destroyer captain saluted as his ship passed the dying Johnston, a mark of respect. From one warrior to another. "Abandon ship," Evans ordered. As men jumped into the oil-covered water, Johnston rolled onto her starboard side, her forward gun still pointed defiantly at the enemy. She sank at 9:45 a.m., taking Commander Evans and 185 of her crew with her. Evans was last seen standing on the bridge as the water closed over him. His body was never recovered. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the decoration. But even as Johnston went down, the battle was turning. Admiral Kurita's nerves had reached the breaking point. The confused reports from his ships, the constant aircraft attacks, the destroyer charges that seemed suicidal, yet somehow continued, all of it convinced him that he faced not a weak escort force, but the vanguard of a major American fleet. At 9:11 a.m., with victory seemingly within grasp, Kurita signaled, "Cease action. Come north with me." The order stunned his captains. The escort carriers were within gun range, visibly damaged, and fleeing south. 1 more hour would have seen them all destroyed, yet Kurita was breaking off the engagement. His reasoning, revealed in post-war interviews, reflected the fog of war at its most disorienting. He believed he was chasing fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. The size difference wasn't apparent at long range. He thought the ferocious defense indicated the presence of cruisers and battleships that he hadn't yet located. His ships had expended most of their armor-piercing ammunition, and he feared being caught by Halsey's returning battleships with empty magazines. Most of all, he had lost faith in the operation. The complex multi-fleet plan had called for coordination that had broken down. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force was supposed to be occupying Halsey far to the north, but Kurita had no confirmation this was happening. Admiral Nishimura's southern force had been annihilated at Surigao Strait. Kurita felt isolated, unsupported, and uncertain. The American escorts and pilots had achieved something extraordinary. They had convinced a superior enemy force that it was fighting an equal or even superior opponent. The destroyer charges weren't just buying time, they were psychological warfare, creating doubt and confusion that no amount of armor or firepower could overcome. As the Japanese fleet turned north, the surviving American ships could hardly believe what they were seeing. The carrier Gambier Bay, dead in the water and burning after taking multiple hits, had expected to be finished off at close range. Instead, the Japanese cruisers that had been pummeling her turned away, leaving her to her fate. She would sink at 9:07 a.m., the only American carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire in World War II, but she sank unmolested rather than being finished off by point-blank fire. Admiral Sprague, watching the Japanese fleet recede into the distance, initially suspected a trick. "They're maneuvering for a better angle," he told his staff. "They'll be back." But as minutes passed and the Japanese continued northward, the realization dawned. Taffy 3 had survived. The cost had been horrific. 3 destroyers and destroyer escorts sunk Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts. 1 escort carrier lost Gambier Bay. The carrier Street, Low would be sunk hours later by a kamikaze attack, the first victim of organized suicide tactics. Over 1,100 American sailors and pilots were dead or missing. Every surviving ship carried damage from shells or near misses, but they had won. The transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf remained untouched. The amphibious operation continued without interruption. The Japanese had expended their last offensive capability in the Philippines and achieved nothing. The survivors of the destroyer screen faced hours or days floating in the ocean before rescue. The waters off Samar held hundreds of men clinging to debris, many wounded, some dying. Sharks circled the oil slicks. The tropical sun burned exposed skin. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, captain of the sunken Samuel B. Roberts, floated with his surviving crew for 2 days before rescue. He spent those hours mentally composing the letters he would write to the families of the men he had lost, 89 dead from a crew of 224. "I thought about what I would tell them," he recalled after the war. "How do you explain to a mother that her son died charging a battleship with a destroyer escort? How do you make her understand it wasn't futile, wasn't waste?" The answer came in the survival of Taffy 3 and the success of the Leyte operation. Every transport that delivered troops safely to the beach, every supply ship that unloaded without being shelled, every American soldier who survived because the Japanese fleet didn't break through all of them, owed their lives to the men who charged anyway. The Battle off Samar entered naval history as one of the most lopsided victories ever, achieved against superior odds. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval War College called it the finest hour of the surface navy. Military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote, "No other naval engagement in history has placed so great a demand on personal courage and initiative." The Japanese never recovered from the psychological blow. They had possessed overwhelming material superiority, 4 battleships, including the largest ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 escort carriers and 7 small escorts. They had achieved tactical surprise, catching Taffy 3 completely unprepared. They had held every advantage except one, the courage and tactical brilliance of American crews who refused to accept the inevitable. Admiral Kurita's retreat haunted him for the rest of his life. In post-war interviews, he insisted he had made the correct decision, given the information available. Yet his own staff officers disagreed. Captain Toshikazu Omae, the senior operations officer, argued that Kurita had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by withdrawing when one more hour would have destroyed the American carriers. For the Americans, the battle validated years of training and tactical doctrine. The aggressive tactics taught at the Naval War College attack when outnumbered, use smoke and maneuver, never surrender the initiative had proven successful even against overwhelming odds. More profoundly, the battle demonstrated that industrial capacity, while crucial, wasn't everything. The Japanese had built the largest battleship in history, but it couldn't prevail against destroyers commanded by men who fought with skill and desperation. Technology and numbers mattered, but so did courage, leadership, and the refusal to accept defeat. The survivors of Taffy 3 returned to heroes' welcomes. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross. The crew of Samuel B. Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. But the greatest honor came from Admiral Sprague himself, who in his after-action report wrote, "The performance of the small boys was magnificent. They went in when they didn't have a chance, fought when they should have been dying, and won when every principle of warfare said they should have lost." The destroyer escorts and destroyers had charged battleships with 5-inch guns because there was no alternative, and in charging, they had achieved the impossible. They had taught the world that sometimes the smallest ships, commanded by the bravest men, can change history. The waters off Samar hold the wreckage of those ships still Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay resting in depths that will likely keep them forever. They are war graves, protected by international law, visited occasionally by deep-sea explorers who marvel at the damage these ships sustained and the fight they put up. But the true memorial to those ships and crews isn't found at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. It's found in the fact that the Leyte operation succeeded, that the Philippines were liberated, and that American forces continued their advance toward Japan, uninterrupted by a naval disaster that never happened because 7 small ships charged anyway. The Battle off Samar proved that in warfare, as in life, courage matters more than size, spirit more than steel, and sometimes, just sometimes, the tin cans with 5-inch guns can defeat the battleships with 18-inch guns if the men who command them refuse to accept the inevitable and fight with everything they have until the very end. Japan sent 8 battleships and heavy cruisers to Leyte Gulf. American destroyers and destroyer escorts with 5-inch guns charged them anyway, and in charging, they won.